Okay, we've got like 17 people on. I'm going to tell him to go ahead and start, right?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hope everybody's doing well this morning. Let me introduce myself to all of you. My name is Gary Katz, and as of April of this year, I am the Executive Director for Cleveland Tenants organization, CTO. Before we kind of get into the meat of our webinar today, I want to let you know a couple things, and I also want to tell you a little bit about myself so I'm not a stranger to you all. This is my first webinar and actually my first PowerPoint presentation, so I'm excited to do it, and if for some reason we get technically discombobulated, we'll certainly straighten things out on our end and take responsibility for any mistakes. As I told you before, I am the new director for Cleveland Tenants organization. Very quickly, some background. I grew up in Greater Cleveland. I went to school in Indiana at Indiana University, and after I graduated in the early 1990s, I moved out to Los Angeles, and I worked in the entertainment industry doing talent management and working on a couple TV shows. If any of you are familiar with shows like Full House, I unfortunately worked on that for a season, and I can answer any questions about that at the end, but hopefully you won't have any about that experience. But I can tell you that I lived through the Rodney King riots when I was out there. And coming from Cleveland, it was a real culture shock. And after you live in your apartment for 3 days with baseball bats and golf clubs ready to defend yourself, sometimes those things change you and they, impact and affect you a little bit. And I came back to the city of Cleveland, started working for a community relations board for the city of Cleveland. It was Mayor White at that time. And from there, I worked for an agency called Bel Air Puritas Development Corporation, which is on the west side of Cleveland. And I learned about mediation, and I became a mediator there, and I actually started my own business. And for a while, I did neighbor quality of life disputes for council people on the east side of the city of Cleveland, and did that for quite a while. And for the last 11 years, I was in City of Cleveland's housing court. I was Judge Pianca's mediator from 2005 to 2017. And the judge passed away in January of this year, and so I just recently took this job at Cleveland Tenants organization. So that's just a kind of a quick snapshot for you, to give you a little background, a little information. All right, why don't we go ahead and go into our webinar, and certainly feel free to ask me questions along the way, or if you want, make your note, and at the end, I'm certainly happy to try my best to answer some of your questions. So first and foremost, I'm going to praise you all, and I'm going to thank you. I don't know how many of you are told on a daily basis that you do amazing work and incredible work, but I'm certainly here to start and to tell you that. I'm really impressed with the work that you have all chosen to do. It's really vital. It's really important. As far as the presentation and as far as Cleveland Tenants organization are concerned, we are not attorneys. So we always tell people we are not providing legal advice to you. We're going to provide some general information and some direction to you. And sometimes that's difficult because people like concrete answers, and unfortunately the law isn't always so black and white as far as how it's interpreted. We can read the law and understand what it says, but it's another thing when it comes into court and gets interpreted. So just be aware of that. There are a lot of ways that situations can unfold, and a lot of them really depend on the details of the circumstances that you're dealing with. So this isn't going to be tremendously in depth. It's going to be a little bit more see-spot run, more of a simplified version of a landlord tenant training. And for those of you who have ever rented before in Ohio in your lives or who are currently renting, this information is for you as well. So it's not just something you pass along through 211, but it's something to know for yourself. And it's something to know for family members and friends who are going to come across some landlord-tenant issues. The agency itself is county-wide, so we serve all cities and municipalities and townships in Cuyahoga County. But the law in Ohio applies to all of Ohio, so hopefully that will be applicable to everybody here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to page forward, and we're going to start by doing our C-spot run. We're going to go through what landlords' responsibilities are. They're not difficult, they're not complex, they're relatively simple as we talk about them, but certainly they're the cause of a lot of problems when people don't understand their responsibilities. And we'll start with the landlord, as hopefully that page continues to load. And I'll wait one moment for that to happen. And it's not happening. All righty. So I'm going to have you folks wait for 1 second if you all be kind enough, and I will get my contact here and confirm that the page isn't loading and find out what's going on. Sorry folks, sit tight for me for a moment, please. Thank you. Okay folks, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay, so we'll kind of go down through this list, and it's a couple pages long, but landlord has a responsibility to put and keep premise in safe and habitable condition. So I always say when we start these things off, if the property doesn't look right to you when you are looking at the property, if there's something physically wrong with the outside of the house, if there are a lot of physical problems on the inside of the house, when you go to look at that property, then that property is not ready for you to rent. And you can certainly let a tenant can let a landlord know when the property is repaired and in rentable condition. I'm certainly happy to come back and look at it, but it's a red flag right away if the property inside and outside you can see physically has problems. So keep common areas safe and sanitary. This is going to be for multi-unit homes and apartment buildings. The stairways, the hallways, any common areas, generally, unless it is specified in the lease that it's not the landlord's responsibility, which would be very unique, then it's the landlord's responsibility to make sure that these things are safe and sanitary. Comply with building, housing, health, and safety codes. So each city is going to have its own ordinances as far as building and housing, health and safety. Many cities are starting to require, specifically Cleveland right now, that rental property be registered with the city of usually the building and housing department. And if there is a rental registry in the city and the property is not on that rental registry, if you go to look at it or the prospective tenant goes to look at it, then perhaps that is not the right property for you to move in, or certainly you're going to know moving in that there's an issue and it's simply not being, the upkeep, the maintenance of it isn't something that the city's involved with since it's not registered. So keep in good working order all electrical, all plumbing, heating, ventilation systems, and fixtures. Unless something is specifically specified in the lease that it's the tenant's responsibility, then it is the landlord's responsibility to make sure these basic quality of life human needs are working properly. Maintain all appliances and equipment supplied or required to be supplied by the landlord. So if you walk into the units and there are existing appliances that the landlord is supplying for the tenant, then it's the landlord's property and it's their responsibility to maintain that. If the tenant brings in a washer and a dryer, if the tenant brings in a stove or a fridge, then the day-to-day maintenance of that appliance is going to be the responsibility of the tenant, not the landlord. But again, any appliances that are existing when you go in, those are going to be the landlord's responsibility to make sure in good working order. Okay, provide running water, reasonable amounts of hot water and heat unless the hot water and heat are supplied by an installation that is under the exclusive control of the tenant and supplied by the utility. That is not what I wanted that to do. Hang on one second. Okay. So it used to be when we were growing up, and I don't know how old everybody is, but it was unheard of that the landlord would make the tenant pay for water. Water was almost always included as part of the basic lease, but that has certainly changed in our lifetimes. And a lot of times the tenant, if it's in the lease, is responsible for maintaining the water bill, then it becomes their responsibility. But when we talk about water, it needs to be specifically in any utility, gas, water, electric. If it's the tenant's responsibility, it needs to be laid out and specified in the lease. So if it is not specified in the lease, it is the landlord's responsibility.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When the landlord does not pay the water bill, and the water gets disconnected,
Yeah.
does the tenant have any recourse? Because usually by that point the bill is pretty high.
Yeah, you know, that's an issue. And it's becoming, you know, as soon as the landlord stops paying for whatever utility, water in this case, the tenant really has to assert themselves with the landlord to find out what's going on. A lot of times if the landlord is unresponsive, what a court may allow you to do is to go into the court in that city, file paperwork along the lines of a TRO, which is a temporary restraining order, and then a lot of times the tenant through the court can deposit money.
Where's it going to get water from? There's no puddles around. There's no rain.
Say this again, I'm sorry.
I think that was Chris.
Oh, okay. So the tenant a lot of times can deposit money through the court onto the water bill in order to, you know, temporarily, and I want to stress the word temporarily, restore the problem. The tenant should be aware that this money is not guaranteed back to them. Nobody is going to go ahead and say, here's your cash, the water department or the court, for the money that you put down on the landlord's water bill. So unfortunately, a lot of times the the tenant ends up having to sue the landlord for the water, and that can be an issue. So as soon as we recognize there's a problem with the water, the landlord and the tenant really need to talk. If it gets to the point where the communication breaks down, the tenant wants to create that temporary water situation, they can usually use the court to do that. But again, it's a temporary situation. So if the landlord and the tenant aren't on the same page, then a tenant may unfortunately have to look for an additional place to live.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We get a lot of calls from tenants who in their lease, especially Section 8, have agreed to pay this water bill, but they can't get any help getting it paid because it's not in their name. What does a tenant do if they're going to enter into some type of lease saying that they're responsible for the water bill? How do they get it in their name? Is it possible to get it turned over in their name so that if they get behind, they may be able to get some help?
Tammy, this is Louise. I just went to a meeting with the Assistant Director of Public Utilities on Friday, and what she said over the Water Department, is there is a form that they have to request from the Water Department. It's a tenant water bill form, and once they fill that out and make a deposit with the Water Department, and it has to be in their lease, then they, according to her, have all the rights of somebody who's a residential customer.
What's the deposit?
I don't know. This was just in the information. I'm still, parsing this out and figuring it out how we'll put it in refer, but there is a way for them to get the same. I don't mean to interrupt, but I just,
no, that's fine.
My understanding, there's a form. They actually have to call customer service at the Water Department and request this form, and they obviously would be doing that probably right at the outset of their lease. But
does
then
the landlord have to sign off?
I don't know what the form looks like, but I would guess that it needs to be in the lease that they pay the water bill, and then they request this form from the Water Department and pay a deposit, and then they should be having the same rights.
Will the bill come to them?
If they're the leased person, or if they're the person who's responsible for the water bill, then the water bill should come to them.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, this will make sure that that happens.
And when we fill out this, yeah, that's fine. And when we do fill out this paperwork, and thank you, Louise, for the information, the landlord should be participating with them. So that if there are any questions at this point, right up front, with regards to water and usage and what paperwork needs to be done, the landlord should really be present. And if the landlord is not present, if they are not participating, then the tenant has to really decide, especially Section 8, if this is the right landlord for them. If the landlord right off the bat is not being forthcoming or helpful as far as water usage, how it will work between us, and it's not in writing, then that should be a red flag to the tenant. There's probably going to be a water issue with regards to that property. A lot of times the tenant is responsible for water, but if there is a major failure to that, sometimes unfortunately the landlord has to step in and take responsibility for the water, because the law says that there has to be water supplied. So unfortunately sometimes it's hard in court for people to hear, well, it's in the lease, the tenant's supposed to do it, they didn't. And sometimes as the court, we used to have to tell them, we understand that they failed on their agreement. You certainly have the right to evict them for that if that's the case. However, landlord, you probably needed to have stepped in to make sure that the utility is working, because the court never on an eviction wants to hear that the utility is not on, especially when there are children in the property.
Well, I have one other question. Say they do all of that and they get it in their name. What does a tenant be able to say they move into an apartment July 1st or a house July 1st, and there was already a prior water bill?
Well, that needs to be discussed, and that's why the landlord needs to be present, because the tenant doesn't inherit the landlord's previous water bill. Okay. They should get their own clean slate, and it should be in writing even in between them on that day. If it's that there's a balance on the account that the tenant's not responsible for, then landlord put it in writing and have both parties sign it right then and there. These things are important to spend time up right at front, because like I said, if there's a problem right at the front as they do these types of things, then there's going to be a problem down the line, and probably pretty quickly. Okay. All right, so moving forward, as far as providing garbage cans or raising for trash removal, the landlord's going to be responsible for doing that on the 4 or more suite buildings, or if the landlord owns 4 or more residential units in the same building. So on the multi-unit buildings, the landlord's going to be responsible for making sure that the city puts the right containers to that property and that the containers are out by the garbage pickup guidelines. Now, we know a lot of times that landlords and tenants work on things like, hey, take the garbage out and I'll give you something off, or take or cut the grass and we'll give you something off. You know, if we have a great landlord-tenant situation, then it's okay, I guess, a lot of times for these things to happen verbally, but it's important, I think, that when there's some sort of agreement between the parties to do something, that it's in writing. It can be even an addendum on the lease that they both sign and date and initial. Otherwise, the responsibility is going to fall back to the landlord. Okay.
I have another question.
Sure.
In the city of Cleveland, I believe people have to pay for their garbage.
Yep.
And who is responsible for that? Is that the landlord or the tenant's responsibility when you're renting?
Well, unless, again, it's specified in the lease, the responsibility is generally going to fall back to the landlord.
Except it comes automatically on your water bill.
Okay, and you know, I'm going to be honest about the water bill. These things are changing a little bit, and it seems like every day we see something else. But if there is a, you know, we need to understand the ordinance and provide generally good information as far as, is that the case? Now, I haven't seen the water bills with the garbage on that yet myself. But if that is going to be a responsibility and the agreement between the parties, again, it should be in writing. And the tenant needs to know these things up front, because these are going to be real costs to them, additional money beyond their subsidy. And again, I would say it will, unless specified in the lease, it's going to fall back to the landlord. All right, we'll move forward. Or maybe not. Here we go. Okay. So under Ohio law, landlord tenant has the right to enter the property anytime they want to for an emergency. So specifically gas, water, or electric, or safety emergency. The landlord is not required to post notice. They have the authority to just enter the property. House is on fire. There's a gas leak. Somebody smells the odor. There's water coming down the walls from a different unit. Those things are basically emergencies, and the landlord can enter. Now, the landlord also has the right to enter the property anytime they want to if it's not an emergency, but they have to post a 24-hour notice. And it should be specific with the date and the time it's posted, as well as the date and the time that will be coming to the property. And if the landlord really misses their own window of time, and it's a couple hours past what is described in the initial 24-hour notice, then the landlord really is going to be responsible for reposting a 24-hour notice. It just doesn't stay open if they miss their time. A lot of times we hope that landlords and tenants are just talking to each other. So in conversation, hey, I'm going to be sending so-and-so over to your house this afternoon, let them in. And, you know, 99 times out of 100, that works out fine because of the relationship between the landlord and the tenant is good. But when it's not, the landlord has the right to access 24 hours for the emergency, or any time for the emergency, and 24-hour notice for any other time they want to enter. Sometimes the tenant says, well, I don't want to give access to the landlord, or the landlord says, I am not, the tenant's not providing access. If they post 24-hour notice and they want to enter the property, it's the landlord's choice whether to force the issue if the tenant doesn't let them in. So can a landlord call the police and say, I posted a 24-hour notice and tenant's not letting me in. I'm calling to let you know it's my intention to enter this property, and I'd like you here to do that. A lot of times the landlords, if the tenant is refusing on any sort of consistent basis, will back off of the property and not try to necessarily enter on a 24-hour notice. But if tenant's refusing access to the property, it's going to be a problem. And if it can't be resolved quickly and it's an ongoing situation, then probably heading towards some sort of breach of the lease and potentially a vacate. And this is important, the next one, obviously inform officers of drug activity by the tenant, members of the tenant's household. You know, what we always tell people is you sign a lease and you are the leaseholder, and as a result you're responsible for any and all activity of your guests when you come over. So if your guests are causing a problem at your property because you invited them over, that's your responsibility. And if it becomes you inviting somebody over who's regularly disruptive, if that becomes problematic, then the landlord can also initiate an eviction proceeding for that. Not specifically you doing it, but your guest. A landlord must disclose his or her name and address or the name and address of his or her agents. So again, this has changed during the course of our lifetime. It used to be very easy to understand this is a large apartment building, it's owned by so-and-so, and they have an X management company coming in, or this is a smaller building and it's privately owned, and I can confirm that. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. And we have out-of-state owners, we have out-of-country owners. People are encouraged to call the city that they live in to make sure that that property is registered again if there's a registry, because the registry should reflect the accurate information of that owner. If not, then perhaps the tenant can ask the city for some assistance identifying the owner of the property, but this is before you move into the property. So if you cannot find out who is the owner of your property, who is the manager of your property, if people aren't being forthright with this information, then you got to recognize that, and it's going to be a problem right off the bat. And Ohio law says if you're a manager of a property, then you should be a real estate broker. You should have a real estate license, and that makes everybody comfortable with the fact that you understand Ohio basically landlord tenant law and real estate law. So a lot of times we have informal relationships between landlords and their management companies, but if in court push comes to shove, the court could ask to see the actual management agreement that describes the relationship between the owner of the property and the management of the property. And again, if you can't find these things out right up front, it's not a mystery. It shouldn't be a mystery. If it is, then you have to make the decision if this is where you want to live.
I have a
Because if
question.
it's a problem, I'll just say really quickly, that's okay. If it's a problem identifying the landlord up front, I can guarantee you as soon as you have problems on the property, it's going to be very difficult to locate that manager or that owner. Yes, go ahead.
I know you said how to get in contact with this registry, but could you give that again? If someone wants to call the registry to find out the name of the landlord, where is that registry housed?
Well, each city is going to be different, and you'll have to find out if each city has a landlord registry program, but it should generally be through that city's building and housing department. So whatever city you're in, Toledo's building and housing, Cleveland's building and housing, or any of the suburbs here around Cleveland are going to have their own building and housing departments. That doesn't mean, though, that there's a landlord registration process in that city. It depends on whether or not that city has an ordinance. If you want to look up the property, and I'll have to check this because I understand that literally as of Friday it may not be available, but the Cuyahoga County auditor, the auditor for the county that you live in, should be recorded, and it should be in the auditor's information. If you pop in your landlord's name and information, or the house of the property that you're at under that city's or that county's auditor, it should pop back who owns that property. It should show you. Now, I could do this on a daily basis, and I did do it on a daily basis for the Cuyahoga County auditor, but I also just read something that said that that website was going to be changed. So after the middle of this month, it may be a little bit more difficult, and we may have to do a little bit more research in Cuyahoga County to confirm who the actual owner of the property is. But again, it shouldn't be a mystery. And if people aren't providing...
Can you call the auditor's office and give a parcel number?
I would absolutely try and do that until we have a better understanding of how they're going to exchange information with us. I don't think it's a problem to go down to the auditor or call the auditor with a parcel number and an address. If it's a multi-unit building, make sure that you write down a couple different addresses from that building, because usually the ownership information is going to be under one of those addresses. Sometimes in a multi-unit building, we would put an address in and it would pop back nothing. And I would say, are you a two-family or a four-suiter? Give me some of the other addresses there. They would give me some of the other addresses, and then we would usually be able to use one of those additional secondary addresses off of your main address to go ahead and locate the ownership information. Okay. All right, we'll move on to our next page. Okay, so this is talking a little bit about leases here. I'll say a couple things heading into it, which is you can enter into a variety of different types of leases. They can be verbal, but they don't, or they can be written, and you can see here the leases are not mandated. So it can be a verbal agreement between the parties in Ohio as far as the rental relationship is concerned. And you know, verbal is okay, but again, it depends on those parties, and you all know, depending upon your experience with the volume of calls that you get, if it's not in writing, then a lot of these things are difficult, and it becomes he said, she said a lot of times as far as responsibility. So tenants should be very careful entering into oral agreements with landlords. The most typical type of lease that you're going to see is going to be probably a standard one-year lease. It's pretty common. Occasionally you're going to see a two-year lease. And what we are also seeing a lot more recently, and we'll talk about this a little bit, are month-to-month agreements. So we have a written lease between us, but it's not a 6-month term or a year term. The term is month to month, and there's a reason that the landlord's doing that. Occasionally we'll also see, especially on boarding houses and that type of thing, week to week type of agreements, but they're not as certainly as common as year agreements or month to month agreements. Last comment here, a tenant can change the locks unless prohibited from doing so in the lease. Usually anytime you change a lock, it's fine, again, unless it's prohibited, but you usually should provide a landlord a copy of the lease if you or a copy of your key if you go ahead and change the locks, because I guarantee you, if a landlord goes to legally access your property and finds that the locks have been changed on the property and there's no communication between you all about it, then that's a potential problem. But you do have the right to change the locks on the property. But I can tell you, I'm also aware of a landlord serving 24-hour notice saying it's not in the lease that you change the lock, that you can change the locks, so I'm giving you a notice, I'm coming over, we're going to change the locks back again, and we'll provide a new key for you. Okay. All right. Under Ohio Landlord law, landlord has a duty to develop consistent methods of communication with your tenants, checking in periodically. So, you know, it's that fine line between my landlord's nosy, and they do a really good job of coming by on a consistent basis to check what's going on with the property. Especially when it comes to, the communication is especially important when it comes to how the money is exchanged for rent at the beginning or whatever their rental agreement is. Is rent mailed to me? Is rent hand delivered to me? Do you drop it off to me? Do I come and pick it up from you? These types of things should be very clear to everybody, and I can tell you in court that the court looks at a landlord's pattern and practice especially when it comes to collecting the rent, when it comes to non-payment. So we all, you and I may be the landlord and you may be my tenants, and we've entered into an agreement that says rent is due on the 1st and late after the 3rd, and I'm going to pick it up. But if 2 months consistently, the landlord changes their process, their pattern and their practice of how they are doing things like collecting the rent, then the landlord has come off of their agreement. And the question then is, when is rent due, and how is it to be collected? So a lot of times if the landlord comes into court, they'd say, well, this is what I've done in the past and I've come off of the agreement. Then the court would basically tell the landlord, you can serve the tenant a 30-day notice and tell them, I may have come off of our agreement to do things on the 1st and pick up this way, but I'm giving you a 30-day notice to let you know, starting beginning of next month or whatever that date is, we're going back to what it says in the lease. So if the landlord just stops coming by to get rent, and they normally come by on the 1st, and they come into court and say, I didn't get rent, then the court says, well, how do you normally collect rent? Well, I normally come by on the 1st. Tell me how you collected rent the last 2 months. Well, I didn't come by on the 1st, but the tenants know it's responsible. Well, now it's gray, because they had an agreement, the landlord changed the pattern in practice, and the court, if they come into court, they're going to want to know, what have you done the last 2 months? How have you come off of your agreement? Screen your tenants consistently. I know a lot of tenants aren't really happy with background checks, but especially on a multi-unit building, you really want to have some faith that the landlord is checking you and really checking all the other tenants and running background checks on them before they come into the building. I know a lot of landlords don't do that, but I think it's important that they do, and I don't think a tenant should be insulted if a landlord asks to run a background check on them. I would hope that it would be more on the lines of safety, again, especially in the multi-unit buildings. And then I like here the landlord. Yeah, go ahead.
So the way that you provide your tenant with the 24-hour notice, is it acceptable to just stick something on the door, or how does that have to be provided to the tenant?
If it's not a relationship where we can just do it verbally, then the landlord is responsible for posting that 24-hour notice on tenant's main access way. So if it's just to their door, if it's a multi-unit building and it's to their door at their property, then it should be taped to the door. We always say to the landlord, you know what, tape one to the door and maybe slide another copy underneath the door. That way you're doing a little overkill to make sure. So it's not, if it's not conversational, the landlord should physically be posting a 24-hour notice on that tenant's main or main exits to the property.
I have a question about the background check. Like when you say you give what kind of background checks is a landlord required by law that, how far can they go? Because, you got given over your social security number to a potential landlord, and then say you don't rent that place. This person's got your personal information.
Right.
What is the if you don't rent it and you've given out your social security number or very personal information, where's the tenant's protection?
Well, and that's a good question, and it's not an easy answer. There's no quick, easy answer for that. The landlord is not obligated to run the background check. They don't have to, but most good professional landlords will. And tenant is generally going to be asked to provide some of that vital information to the landlord to run the background check. And if the tenant isn't comfortable providing that information to the landlord for whatever reason, then tenant shouldn't do it. I also don't think it's a problem for a tenant to ask the landlord for references. So landlord, you're going to background check me. Are there any other tenants or former tenants that I can talk to about you, and give the tenant some comfort as far as this is a good landlord, they seem to be a legitimate landlord based on the references and my check that I've done, and I feel comfortable giving them that information. The landlord could say, look, I can't force you to give me the information, but if you don't want to give it to me and I can't run the background check on you, I probably am not going to let you live in the unit. So if
what
something
background are they looking for, though? Is this to check eviction court, check the sex offender registry,
well,
or your credit?
It could be everything. It can be full background check. It's really going to depend on who the landlord uses for screening.
Okay.
So
is the tenant responsible to pay for any of this?
The landlord can ask the tenant. A lot of times it's really the price of doing business for the landlord, but the landlord can ask the tenant, I want you to pay for the service, and then the tenant can say, okay, if you want to pay for the service, great. If not, I'm not going to provide my own background check for you. Then again, that's the landlord and the tenant making the decision. Doesn't look like this relationship is, going to be a good fit. But the background checks, anytime that you are in court for almost any situation, it goes in public record, and it becomes a public document that there's a case or some sort of court, something associated with this person. And generally speaking, once you are in court, it doesn't come off of your background. It really is how far is the agency who's checking you, how far do they look back? And it's generally standard for about a 5 to 7 year look back. Okay. Then the last note on this page, landlord is a full-time job. Does not end with the receipt. Always have monetary reserve in case of emergencies. Well, we all hope that when we enter into a home ownership situation that we've got money on reserve, but we also know that's not always the reality of the situation. So this is my first time going through this PowerPoint. I think it's a great comment that we all should be aware of, but we also know the reality of that situation, that sometimes that just doesn't happen. But if your landlord isn't in a good position financially and isn't able to do the repairs on the house, and that's why that first look at the property, when they show it to you, is really important. Doesn't look like they're in a good financial position to maintain that property, especially if it doesn't look right when you're looking at it initially. All right. Going to the next page. Develop, and here we go. Okay, health and safety. Healthy, sanitary, and safe. It's the landlord's duty to create a healthy home, tenant's duty to maintain it. As far as certainly letting the landlord know that there's a problem if it's something that they can't maintain. So as far as keep it dry, damp basements, leaks from plumbing, fixtures, roofs, baths, kitchens without fans, all these can create moisture and mold problems. Moisture and mold are pretty common issues. Anything that is underground in this part of the country can be, if it's not waterproof properly, can be subjected to, water seepage in the property. And a lot of times tenants I will hear in court said to me, well, there's black mold in the house. Just because the color of the mold is dark doesn't mean it's black mold. So tenants should be careful saying it's a specific type of mold unless it's actually tested. And you can have the health department or the building and housing department and inspector come out and actually test that for you if you want to be sure of what type of mold it is. The next comment starts to head towards lead, and we will talk about it on and off a little bit. Lead's, there aren't many statewide contentious issues, but certainly lead is contentious. And right now, so that we're all on the same page, in the state of Ohio, there's home rule, meaning each city has its own health department, its building and housing department, and it's going to have its own ordinances as far as lead is concerned. Toledo, a couple years ago, put forward a very strict lead law ordinance as far as what needs to be done to a property to make it lead safe. And as of a couple months ago, one of the legislators outside of Toledo put legislation in front of the Senate, the House and the Senate, and it's being debated right now whether or not the cities are going to be allowed to maintain home rule with regards to lead. The ordinance is basically asking that the state, not the city, take responsibility for inspecting properties and enforcement on failed properties with regards to lead. But as it stands today, right now, at this moment, it's the city's responsibility, and it goes to city ordinance. Lead dust residue from pesticides found in carpets, floors, and hard surfaces. Contaminants can be tracked into the home and may be present in an even greater health hazard. So again, if it looks when the tenant comes into the property, especially around the window sills and things like that, that there's a tremendous amount of cracking and lead dust or dust over there, then that's a problem. If a landlord is showing a tenant a property, it should be move-in ready, and it should generally come with a fresh coat of paint, if not something that is certainly not cracking or dusty all over the place. Okay, moving down. Release 24-hour notice, keep it dry. Okay, keeping it pest-free. So droppings from pests as well as their body parts are major triggers for people with asthma. Eliminating pests eliminates this threat. Are you guys getting a lot of phone calls about bed bugs and these types of things?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, you know, we'll talk about it in a little further detail, but obviously infestations are an issue right now, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. Keep it well ventilated. Don't contaminate the home by using products with strong odors. Circulate fresh air. People living in the home, keep air flowing near gas surfaces, hot water tanks, dryers, and stoves. And that's all, you know, for you all as well in your own private homes as far as keeping things well ventilated. If you walk into the property to look at it, if it's dark, if it's musty, if it's damp, these types of things are red flags for the tenant. Perhaps it is not the place that you should be moving into. Okay. Radon, if you're familiar with it, I personally don't have a lot of experience with it. It hasn't been used a lot, but it is a naturally occurring colorless and odorless gas. It can seep into a home from the ground and can lead to lung cancer, especially for smokers. Smoking obviously is an indoor air quality problem. And homes, if there's any concern that a tenant has about radon, gas, that type of thing, they should be calling their health department, their building and housing department, and have an inspector come out and take a look at something. As far as keep it safe is concerned, extension cords under a rug are a fire hazard. Railings and stairs, if there are rugs that are slippery and sliding, if they're not fixed to the surface properly, obviously it can cause easy falls. Unlocked cabinets with drugs or chemicals can lead to the poisoning of a child. So sometimes in a common area, especially in a multi-unit building, a landlord may have a closet that they use to keep their chemicals in for cleaning that main area. And that's their responsibility to maintain that area and making sure that really nobody has access to it, certainly not children. Okay. Moving forward. And again, this is kind of see, spot, run, and we'll get into some more detailed stuff as we move forward, but landlord has the duty to keep it well maintained. This is really speaking more specifically to threats of safety and health at the home. This is an ongoing issue in multi-unit buildings, but if one landlord or one tenant's causing another problem for another tenant, then it's going to be the landlord's responsibility a lot of times to step in. A lot of times they'll try and serve as a neutral party and kind of mediate the situation. And again, it depends on that landlord and those tenants. But if one tenant is causing a real safety or quality of life problem for another tenant, it's really the landlord's responsibility to step in and take care of the problem. And sometimes that involves mediating the tenant that's causing the problem, or evicting the tenant, excuse me, that's causing the problem. All right, moving forward, back to lead on this PowerPoint. Landlord has a responsibility. Federal law requires that owners of properties built before 1978 must give prospective tenants a written statement of any known lead hazards and pamphlets on lead poisoning. Again, this is something that's law. It's something that we like to see, but unfortunately it doesn't happen a lot, and the tenants a lot of times don't even know to ask for it. But they certainly have the right to know, again, if the house is built before 78, what has the landlord done as far as painting and lead hazard in the property. And again, these things aren't going to be difficult to find. If there are become contentional in conversation between the landlord and the tenant, then tenants should be saying to themselves, problem. Landlord's not being upfront. We haven't even moved into the property, and we're not getting upfront information about these types of things. In Ohio, landlord has a duty to implement lead preventative treatments, which includes performance of essential maintenance practices. Landlords must keep a lead-safe home. So right now, it's going to go according to city ordinance. Again, now you all know what's going on in the state as far as trying to take some responsibility from the city, but as it stands right now, you're going to have to know in your city what the responsibilities are as far as health and healthy safety practices for lead. And if you need to get specific training, and it's never a bad idea, because for a lot of our landlords, our homes in Ohio are older than 78, to get some training about it. There are some basic things that landlords can do to make it a kind of a lead-safe home as opposed to a lead-free home. But again, you got to consult with your city and check out with the health department and building and housing what the ordinance are. And the other thing with regards to lead is, you know, lead's a contaminant that really has, it's really present in all our property, in all our land around our property by virtue of the way lead was used years ago. So a lot of times if landlords didn't do the proper preparation for exterior painting on property, and they left a lot of lead paint chips over the years in the property, then that can ultimately contaminate the soil around there. And the worst thing you want is for the child to go out, start playing immediately around the house. We know that they get dirty, they get their hands into things, and they don't necessarily wash them when they come back in the house. But unfortunately, you can't assume in houses that are older than 78 that that isn't something that contaminated the soil at some point. All right. Implement. And I'm just catching myself up here. Okay. So by doing these things, by practicing lead, basically safe prevention practices, you're providing protection against the lawsuit. And the landlords need to be aware of that, especially as laws may be changing or responsibility for enforcement of laws changes. The landlords need to stay on top of it. And if they're not, at some point, lawsuits are going to start to come against the landlords. If you're in Cleveland, you may be aware of the health department coming out, testing property, and posting on the property a placard that says vacate the property. So that's something that's literally just started in the last couple months. And then here's a suggestion for landlords as far as keeping all the paperwork for at least 3 years. I don't think it's a bad idea to keep it for 5 years, and certainly taking photos and repairs of all the safety steps that you have taken. And obviously you don't want to bring somebody in to help you with your lead problem, resolving it, if they are not lead certified in the state of Ohio. That's going to cause a problem for you. All right, again, in Ohio, landlord has a responsibility. EPA requires that firms performing renovation, repair, and painting, they disturb lead-based paint prior to 78, the homes be certified by the EPA, and they use the certified renovators who are trained by EPA approved trainers to provide lead-safe work practices. Again, unfortunately, a lot of times these things don't happen, but when you're asking to see the law as far as state and federal response to lead, then that's what the law is going to ask you to do. And a lot of landlords, frankly, aren't jumping through these hoops. So if they're not, and the tenant can't confirm this information about what the landlord has done with the property over the last couple of years, again, the pre-1978, this should be a red flag for the tenant. The landlord's not providing all the information to me about what's been going on, and they haven't been bringing lead-safe contractors in to do the actual work. All right. And this is a snapshot from, obviously, child lead poisoning. It's specific to Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, but again, you can go to your city, or you can go to your county, and you can talk about lead in general, get all lead information that you can, so that we're all clear and we're all on the same page. Lead poisoning does not go away. Once you're lead poisoned, you're lead poisoned. There are things that can be done to mitigate some of the things, some charcoal, oral applications that a doctor can provide, but clearly the most important time in our lives as far as lead poisoning is going to be concerned is during your childhood. It's the easiest time to be contaminated and affected by that. All right, now we kind of switch over a little bit with regards to tenant responsibilities. And again, this is kind of see-spot run stuff. It's not difficult, but when these things start going south, that's when the problems happen. So you're responsible for keeping your unit safe and sanitary, disposing of your rubbish properly, as indicated in the lease, and you're doing the work on the plumbing as far as keeping these things clean, condition permits, using things with electricity and plumbing properly. If a tenant isn't sure about how to use these things, then they need to bring the landlord in to make sure that they understand. A lot of times with air conditioning or with furnaces, they can be a little temperamental, so the tenant should be asking the landlord if they don't understand what's going on, how does this work? Show me. Okay? Tenant has to comply with housing, health, and all safety codes that apply to that tenant. Refrain from damaging the premise, and again, keeping guests from causing damage. Your guests are your responsibility. Maintain appliances supplied by the landlord in good working order. So if it's the landlord's stove, you clean it, you keep it working. If it fails, then you've got to contact the landlord right away and let the landlord know there's a problem with it. Conduct yourself in a manner that does not disturb any neighbors and require guests to do the same. This is where we start to get into quality of life issues. The most common ones I hear of are noise and or music at all hours of the night, and also the way people move around their apartments. So certainly if you don't like the neighbor above you and below you, a lot of times there's ceiling knocking or foot stomping that goes on. And these are quality of life issues, and there may be something in the lease about disturbing quality of life. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, your music is too loud, music should be maintained at a level where you can hear it comfortably inside your unit. And if you're broadcasting at something that's heard well beyond your unit, then you may be violating somebody else's quality of life. All right. Move down again. We'll move to our next slide. Here we go. Tenant has a duty to permit landlord to enter the dwelling unit if request is reasonable and proper notice is given. This goes back to our 24-hour notice. So if the landlord posts that notice, the tenant's going to be generally responsible for giving the landlord access. Drug laws, certainly if there's a violation of state drug law, trafficking is usually the issue. But certainly personal consumption in a unit, these things are going to cause quick evictions for tenants. Certainly trafficking, meaning a lot of people in and out, distribution of drugs, that's just going to be a matter of time before landlord moves to evict a tenant for these reasons. All right. Permit landlord. All right, next screen. All right, if a landlord does not meet the duties imposed by law, what does the tenant do? And these are going to be some of your most common questions. So one of the things that happens is the tenant gets frustrated because they have asked the landlord to fix something repeatedly, and the landlord hasn't done that. And what the tenant does is they give partial rent or they withhold rent. And what they've done at that point is they put themselves into a non-payment situation. So if there is a problem, physical problem with the property, the tenant is responsible for writing a notice to the landlord to correct. A lot of times what I tell tenants, I ask them, how do you pay rent? Well, the landlord comes by or I gets dropped off in this location. Then what I tell the tenant to do is put your rent in an envelope and include in the envelope a 30-day notice to correct. The law requires you to put something in writing. So I know texts and emails are pretty common, but the law is saying, at least right now, we want to see a written notice. And a lot of times if people come into the court and they say, well, we gave the landlord an email or we gave the landlord a text about this, the court a lot of times says print it out because we want to see it. So what this notice looks like is, if it's in writing, is on the top it can say 30-day notice. Landlord, I'm giving you written 30-day notice to correct the following problems with the property. Now look, escrow is good and this letter is good if there are 1 or 2 or 3 things wrong with the property. But if there are 50 things wrong with the property and the ceiling caves in, the problem's a little beyond this. But the law is going to require you to stay current with your rent and serve the landlord this notice. You should sign it, you should date it, and make a photocopy of it. So what you've just done is you've stayed current with your rent and you've then put the landlord on written notice, 30 days to correct. At the end of 30 days, you are going to have some options. If you have an escrow program, and most cities will have them, and no corrections were made within 30 days, then most courts will allow you to bring your rent for the following month and a copy of that written 30-day notice down to court, and the court will escrow the rent. The court will accept the rent. So if the landlord says you never paid me rent, non-payment of rent, well, they did pay properly. They served you proper notice and the court's holding escrow. So a landlord is in a very difficult position to win a non-payment of rent situation if the tenant has properly escrowed. So escrow is one option at the end of 30 days. What else can you do? Well, if you have a year lease or a 2-year lease and the landlord has not responded, did the landlord just break the lease by not responding to your proper 30-day notice? And if you are interested in vacating the property at that point, you can serve a new 30-day notice to the landlord, usually with rent. And the conversation or the notice is something like this: landlord, you failed to repair properly based on 30-day notice. I'm going to pay you rent for this month, but I'm also going to use this notice. I'm vacating the property in 30 days.
I have a question.
Yes.
What about the security deposit? Are they able to say, I used the security deposit?
No.
Or, okay, how do they get it back?
All right, so, and I'll go to security deposit. It's a little later, so if it's okay, I will just put that on the side for right now because we'll have a screen. We'll just talk about security deposits right at the end. Just going back to that 30-day notice, if the landlord hasn't complied, you can escrow your rent. You can potentially give a 30-day notice that you're vacating the property, or unfortunately, a lot of tenants just let it go and they don't do anything. They stay in the property and they just live in the condition. I want to make a quick comment about B, under apply to the court for an order to compel repairs. So if there's a serious enough situation, ceiling falls in, no heat in the middle of winter, these types of things, most courts will provide an opportunity for you to come in and file what's called a motion to compel. These are serious situations where a 30-day notice is not going to be appropriate. They're usually relatively expensive to file because you're really filing a full court case. So in Cleveland, it's around $120 to file a motion to compel. But if it's a serious situation and it's not something that's going to wait for 30 days to see if the landlord is going to fix it, a tenant can kind of go around the 30-day notice process and they can go ahead and file a motion to compel. A lot of our tenants who are on subsidy can go to legal aid and they can swear an income statement or a poverty affidavit. And they can bring that income statement or poverty affidavit to the court with that motion to compel. And what that usually does is, at least in Cleveland, the $120 filing fee gets waived down to around $20 to let the tenant file. And that will bring the case in front of a magistrate. When you do escrow mediation, usually it comes before a court mediator. Can we sit and resolve? Whereas the motion to compel is more serious, and it's usually going to have a magistrate provide over the situation who's probably going to end up ordering something with that case. So I want everybody to be okay with how to respond to the physical problems with the property before we move on, because even at CTO, the majority of calls we get are pertaining to landlord not fixing the problem. Is everybody okay with responses to failures to fix now?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So at the end of the 30 days, tenant puts their rent into escrow. At the end of the 30 days, for the landlord to collect the rent, do they have to provide, what does the landlord then have to provide, if anything, in order to collect that rent?
Well, in Cleveland, you have a mediation.
Okay.
And a lot of times how the money is dispersed based on what's going on that property is part of the mediation agreement.
I see. Okay.
Now, if in Cleveland a mediation doesn't work, then that tenant has the right to file that motion to compel at that point. I want to bring this case out of mediation in front of a magistrate for a hearing, which will resolve the money.
Okay.
Or if the landlord wants to try to get the money, they can usually file what's called a landlord's application. It's usually for full or partial release from the escrow. But a landlord has to show the court, they have to prove to the court that the corrections that the tenant was citing in their notice have been corrected. So there are times where the tenant just won't release the money. They're angry afterwards, and the landlord has to file the application to force the release of the money. Or a tenant leaves the property and they never release the money. And then the landlord doesn't get the money back in that case, and still, unless they're able to show the court I've made the repair on the property. And I'll be honest with you, at the end of every year, at least in Cleveland, there are literally thousands of dollars left in the clerk of courts held in escrow because the tenant says to themselves, I had to pay rent to somewhere, so I'm not going to go back for the money again. That's my rent for that month. And the landlords a lot of times haven't made the repairs on the property. And if they don't make the repair on the property, they can't come in and claim the escrow either. They can try, but it doesn't always happen.
Does the tenant have any rights to it? Say the landlord in 30 days does not make the repair and the tenant has to move and they put that money in escrow. Are they entitled to get it back?
So the tenant can file that motion to compel. So the tenant's going to file the motion to compel one of two times. Either it's such a serious situation that it's not going to require a 30-day notice, I just want it in front of a magistrate, or we wait our 30 days, we escrow our rent, we come in for mediation, it doesn't work, then the mediator will tell you, well, folks, you're going to have to file your motions to bring it in front of a magistrate. So one of the things under the motion to compel for the tenant is one of the boxes that you can check is monetary damages. So I've been harmed as a result of this situation, and I can prove it to the court, and I want my $400 returned back to me, and they ask for that money to come back to them through motion to compel. And it comes in front of the magistrate for the hearing. The tenant should know once the money goes into escrow, it only comes out one of two ways. By a voluntary agreement between the parties, the landlord and the tenant mediate it and they reach an agreement, or court order. Somebody files the application for release or somebody files the motion to compel, and based on the end of that hearing, the court orders something to happen. Otherwise, that money stays in escrow. And the tenants need to know that when they escrow their rent, that if the landlord doesn't make the fix, you don't automatically get that money back. You can ask for it back through the motion to compel, but it doesn't automatically come back to you. Is that a good answer? Did that answer? Okay, I just want to make sure that answered that for you.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
I mean, if a tenant is calling us and is having complicated, landlord tenant issues, I'm referring them to you, the Cleveland Tenants Organization, because the ins and outs of landlord tenant law, it's fine that you can give them the first sentence, but then when they ask a question, I really feel that's beyond the knowledge that I have to provide to them. So we're not supposed to be really answering and interpreting the landlord tenant law, are we?
I preface the conversation by saying to you, we are not attorneys. We just are an information agency as well. You can relay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Much more knowledgeable in landlord tenant law because it's something you have to do every day.
Absolutely. And, you all have to make the decision comfort level wise, what information I'm providing to you that you're comfortable sharing with the other parties. So if it is getting more difficult, if technically you're not comfortable with where it goes, then send them to the court, send them to a private attorney, or send them to our agency so that we can talk to them a little bit. That's kind of what I was talking about from the beginning as far as, we can provide some general information, but a lot of these situations are complicated. They're difficult, and this is really just a C-spot run training. So you're going to be able to provide some general information to them, but they should be encouraged to follow up with us. The law, in each situation is its own animal. It takes on its own life. So you're going to have some questions that are going to be really easily answered. You're going to have others based on the information that you're just not comfortable continuing, and then those are going to be good referrals for you.
Whatever's in refer, right, Louise?
Is that okay?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
I muted it.
No, I understand. I understand. All right. I'll move on. All right. Move backwards a little bit. This is a little bit more detail about the landlord. Landlord may give a tenant a written notice to correct conditions. Notice must be in writing, keep a copy. Tenant must correct conditions within 30 days. If the requested correction is not made by the tenant within 30 days, a landlord can terminate the tenancy, pursue an eviction action. So I will get a little bit more technical with you about it, and I'll provide information to say, if the landlord says the lease is being breached, they're going to serve one or two different types of notices to the tenant to correct it, but it's going to be based on the type of violation. If there is a health or safety problem with the property, it generally requires a landlord to serve a 30-day notice to correct it. And those are the terms that we use, health and safety. And it's on the landlord to determine for themselves when they serve notice, is this health or safety? So say, for example, we have a no pets clause in the lease. And the tenant goes ahead and brings a dog into the property. That doesn't require a 30-day notice because there's no health or safety component to the dog necessarily being in your property, but it's a clear breach of the lease. So when there's a health or a safety breach, 30-day notice to correct. When there is any other type of breach in the lease, it usually falls under a straight 3-day notice, tenant correct this activity. Unauthorized occupants, 3-day notice. Move those people from your property, that type of thing. So that's generally how a landlord is going to look at a property, and that's generally how they're going to serve you notice to correct something or resolve something. Usually a 30-day notice or a 3-day notice, and the distinction is going to be, is there a health or a safety component to the lease violation? Okay. This is an interesting one here. We talk about a landlord may not retaliate against. So unfortunately, a lot of times landlords do retaliate against tenants for doing something. You can't ever stop somebody from trying to retaliate, but if they do retaliate against you, then you have your right to seek your own private legal advice and pursue the landlord back again, perhaps through the countersuit. So in the middle of a lease, a landlord cannot just raise the rent. They cannot decrease services. And they can't evict for no reason. They just can't tell you to leave the property. If you have a lease with somebody, the lease stands for the landlord and the tenant. It's the written agreement between you. A landlord cannot retaliate if there's a complaint against the property to a public official. Complain to the landlord too many times. You've complained to me. I'm tired of it. The landlord just can't turn around and evict and retaliate that way. Sometimes tenants try to organize a council in their building, a resident advisory council. If the tenants go ahead and organize these things, that's okay by law. And if the landlord tries to evict because tenants are doing these types of things, then the tenant or the landlord could potentially be retaliating against the landlord and can open up a lawsuit against themselves. But we're human beings, and we know that landlords and tenants are human beings. And a lot of times there are subtle forms of retaliation that can happen. They're always going to be prohibited by law, but that doesn't mean that once the landlord-tenant situation starts to go south, once it starts to not go right, these little tit-for-tat things can happen, and sometimes it comes out in the form of retaliation. We're human. We know these things can happen. Next slide, self-help eviction prohibited. Whether or not a tenant's right to occupy a residential unit has ended, the landlord may not just shut off the utilities on the property. They can't change the locks to force the tenant to move from the unit. They cannot seize the tenant's possessions. So if we're in court, and a lot of times we would tell the tenant when we became aware of these things, you know, call the court. What the court does is they give a 24-hour courtesy notice to a landlord. So landlord, we understand the utilities, gas, water, or electric have been shut off to the property. We are giving you a courtesy call, and the court can usually do it to let you know, restore these things. And if they don't, then the tenant can call us back again. Change the locks to force the tenant. Those are self-help evictions. Landlord cannot just come in and change the locks on the property. Tenant a lot of times has the right to just access the property again. If they want to call the police, we've been in situations before where the police have said, did the landlord evict you? And the tenant says, no, they didn't. And the police officer will say, well, they never evicted you. They changed the locks on your property. That's your property. That's your stuff in there. I'm not going to tell you don't have the right to access it. So if a tenant goes in through a back window, because that's how they get in with the police standing there, well, they're not breaking into somebody else's unit, are they? They're going into their own unit. So they're not going to be arrested for doing that. And if the landlord takes the tenant's possessions, then the tenant has the right to ask for them back. If the landlord does not return them, then the tenant usually is going to have the right to sue the landlord for what their property is worth in small claims court. And I haven't forgotten about the security deposit. That'll wrap into that as well. But landlords just can't do these things. And they can be on the receiving end of a lawsuit if they go ahead and do self-help evictions, change the locks, shut off the utilities, or seize possessions. All right.
But if the landlord does any of those things, what the tenant should do is to call the police?
Tenant can call the police, or tenant can call the court.
Court, housing court. Right.
You can call the housing court, right.
Okay.
The police may or may not respond to it depending upon the circumstances as they unfold on that day. But a court should be willing to give a courtesy 24-hour notice. And I've done it before. Landlord, I'm not saying that the situation exists. I'm just telling you your tenant is calling the court to let them know X is happening or Y is happening. They've been locked out of the property, the utilities shut off. Court is now giving you a 24-hour courtesy notice. Restore that utility, get access to that person, give them access to the property again. All right, self-help eviction.
I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
So even if this is in the middle of an eviction process, so if they have a set out date for, you know, a week from now, and they're in the middle of that process, if the landlord does this, the court can compel them to turn that back on.
Well, you can ask them to, correct.
Okay.
It gets a little tricky when maybe you've already been to court and there's an eviction against you and the landlord does something to try to lock you out. The court's still going to give the courtesy phone call to the landlord. Generally, there's only one of two ways to leave the property. You voluntarily go and or you surrender your key, or you're not voluntarily leaving. There's a court order on the property and you have the right to maintain the property and possess it until the bailiff comes and physically removes you from the property. Okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right. And if it's
I'm
okay
sorry,
with...
I got one more question.
Yeah, of course.
With this. Say the bailiff comes and they set a person out Are they setting all their belongings out, or is the tenant have a right, say, it's in the middle of winter or something like that, and they know they're getting evicted and they didn't get a truck or were unable to do whatever, are they still allowed to maybe come back and get their stuff, or does everything just go out on the curb?
When the bailiff comes, everything should be removed from the property and everything should go to the curb. The landlord should have a licensed and bonded mover on standby. The bailiff doesn't actually do the move out. The bailiff is there to make sure that the tenant doesn't interfere with the court-ordered move out. And they're there to make sure that the landlord's moving company has access to move all the property from the unit to the tree lawn. Unless there's some agreement or relationship between the landlord where the landlord gives access back to the tenant to get a couple of other things, usually doesn't happen. Usually what the landlord will say is, if you don't want your stuff to be on the tree lawn, then get everything out of the property that you don't care about before the move-out date. Because once that move-out date happens, that landlord wants to remove that civil liability, that possibility they could get sued by having the bailiffs through the moving company, through the bailiffs and the court order, move everything to the tree lawn. Does that answer it? Okay. Okay, excellent. All right. We are getting close. Eviction action, as far as the landlord's concerned, a landlord can bring an eviction action against a tenant when the tenant has, obviously, that's the majority of your cases, failed to pay rent on time, occupied the unit after the termination or expiration of the rental agreement, or failed to live up to the term in their lease. So obviously, these three things are going to be the quickest, most common ways for landlords to file evictions against a tenant. It's pretty, self-explanatory. Certainly not paying rent is going to be number one on that. All right. Talk about how to bring an eviction action. You're looking at some language on this notice. This is a standard 3-day notice, and it's valid anywhere in the state of Ohio. It's valid because it has language on it that is specific, it is bold, and it's more than double size the print of anything else on the page. This is a proper 3-day notice, and that language, you are being asked to leave the premise. If you do not leave, an eviction action may be initiated against you. If you're in doubt, etc., etc. That language must be on the 3-day notice. If the tenant got a 3-day notice from the landlord and that language is not on there, it's not a true 3-day notice. It will not hold up in court, just so that you're aware of. Okay. Next slide. This is a notice to leave premise. I won't get stuck with that. But again, you're seeing the same language at the bottom. Just making sure that you see it again twice. It's that exact same language, bold and separate. And then this is just an example for landlords. You guys don't have to worry really about this as far as how something would be filled out, that notice. So really won't spend time with that. As far as serving the 3-day notice is concerned, a landlord has to wait 3 business days after they serve the notice. No weekends, no holidays, and the day that the notice is served does not count as a service day. So I want to serve you all a 3-day notice. I can serve it to you today, Wednesday, but the first day doesn't start clicking on that 3-day notice until tomorrow. So Thursday, Friday, no weekends or holidays, so technically Monday is the 3rd day on a 3-day notice. And after Monday, so starting Tuesday, if I serve you a notice today, the landlord can come in and file an eviction complaint. But it has to be 3 full business days. no weekends or holidays. If the tenant doesn't comply, then it opens the door for the landlord to file the eviction. That forcible entry into detainer is an eviction, just a different way to say it. Then the clerk of courts takes that paperwork and they send out usually regular and certified mail to the tenant once the eviction has been filed in court. And then you're going to have a hearing that comes forward 3 weeks after the date of filing. So landlord serves a 3-day notice. They have to wait their 3 business days. Then they can file their eviction, and the eviction case won't be heard until 3 weeks after the actual case is filed in court. So when tenants say to you, how much time do I have, that's generally how much time they would have before they would come into court.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If they leave, say they disregard the 3-day notice, and the landlord goes ahead and files through the court, but they leave before the court date, does that still stay on their eviction? Does that give them an eviction notice?
Anytime the case is filed, it goes on your record that an eviction complaint is filed, that a court case is filed against you. If the tenant leaves the property prior to the actual court date and surrenders the key, then we would advise the tenant, especially if they have a landlord that they're not sure about, we would advise the tenant to go to the court date so they can testify on the record in front of the magistrate, I have vacated the property, I have surrendered the key. Then usually what happens is the court dismisses the case, at least the first part of it, the eviction, the possession part of the hearing. Then it's important for a tenant, if the case is dismissed, a couple days later after that, to wait for it to be recorded by the clerk and then go to the clerk of courts and get a certified copy from them that the case is dismissed. So that when the next person runs the background check, a landlord may say, well, you got evicted last month, and the tenant responds with, I had an eviction complaint filed against me. There is no eviction on me. Here's a certified copy of the dismissal. But anytime any of us ever, anywhere in the country, has a lawsuit filed against us, regardless of what it's about or how it resolves, it will still show on a background check that a case has been filed. I had a tenant come after me, and even though the case is dismissed, I've had people come to me and say, well, we ran the background check, you've got this case, and I had to get a certified copy of the dismissal to say, yes, I agree, the case was filed against me, but it's dismissed. Because running a background check doesn't necessarily show you that a case is dismissed. But as soon as that case is filed, it's going to go on your permanent record that a case is, that has been filed against you. All right. This is going to landlord's right of access to the property. I'm not going to really say much more about landlord's right on this screen. I think that we have beaten that one up pretty well. Next one, rent increases, late charges. So on a month-to-month agreement, the landlord, if they want to increase the rent, they have to give a 30-day notice that they're going to do it. If you have an existing lease for a set amount of time, 6 months or a year, that it has a specific amount of rent due, the landlord cannot increase the rent during the course of an active lease. They're obligated to keep that rent what it is, just like the tenant's obligated to pay it. But you just can't go ahead in the middle of a lease and raise the rent. And the 30-day month-to-month agreement, it's going to require a 30-day notice. And I want to make a real important general comment to you about these 30-day agreements, about these month-to-month agreements. If you have a month-to-month agreement, It only requires a 30-day notice to vacate, and that's it if the landlord wants to possess the property. So we could be causing problems up one side and down the other. We could not be getting along with our landlord, and the landlord serves us a termination of tenancy on a month-to-month agreement. I'm giving you a 30-day notice. I'm letting you know I'm terminating our tenancy. Tenant says, well, is this about our argument? Is this about this or is this about that? The truth of the matter is, yeah, it's probably about that, but the nature of the month-to-month agreement says all the landlord has to do is serve a 30-day notice, termination of tenancy, but it works the same way for the tenant. The tenant can serve notice to the landlord. Landlord, I'm giving you 30-day written notice. I'm going to be vacating the property in a month. Causes and reasons don't have to be stated on termination of tenancy on a 30-day, on a month-to-month agreement. So make sure that tenants understand when they enter into a month-to-month agreement, landlord just has to serve you a 30-day notice, and they can end the agreement regardless of what may be going on in the property. And I see a lot, honestly, I see a lot of landlords switching to month-to-month agreements because a lot of them are getting beat in court and they're failing, they're not winning their evictions for regular termination of tenancy under a lease. So I know a lot of landlords have said, you know what, we're going to just do a month-to-month agreement because I can just end it. I can end it anytime I want to on a month-to-month agreement. No rent control in Ohio, that's correct. Landlord tenant law does not cover late charges. Late charges may be included on the rental agreement, but they can't be unconscionable, they can't be unfair. I can tell you in Cleveland, and each city may have its own ordinance, City of Cleveland specifically says landlord can charge you $25 maximum a month if your rent is $500 or less. If your rent is $500 or more, the most the landlord can charge you is 5% of the rent. But that's when it comes into court and they're asking us to enforce late payments. So if you as a landlord and me as a tenant enter into an agreement that says $50 a month and nobody's there to dispute it, the agreement is illegal by Cleveland's ordinance, but you're not going to know about it until it actually comes into court. So a lot of times tenants will go ahead and pay a $50 late fee if it says that in the lease, and that's what the parties have agreed to. But if it comes into court and tenant says, I charged them a $100 late fee this month, and the court's going to respond back and they're going to say, how much is your rent? And we're going to award you based on the city ordinance, $25 for 500 or less, or 5% for 500 or more. But we also know, realistically speaking, people enter into slightly different agreements, and when they're not a problem, we never hear about them. But when they come into court, that's what the ordinance is going to say in Cleveland. And if we have questions about different cities, we should ask those cities about their ordinances.
Okay, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So if you signed the lease agreement, I just moved, and it wasn't in my lease that I had to have the carpet professionally cleaned before I left. But
Okay.
They gave me a notice saying that.
Okay.
Do I go by the lease or the notice that they provided?
Well, you know, I am not going to say that it's required that you professionally clean it unless it's specified in the lease. If there's something that says upon vacating the property, you are required to do a checklist with us and do these things, then I think it's pretty clearly spelled out. Other than that, I don't know that the landlord says you must have this professionally cleaned.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have another question too.
Yeah.
About the late fee.
Yeah.
If it's in the lease, but the tenant was not understanding or didn't know the law, and they end up going to court, the court will still mandate the law, or will they go by the lease?
They'll go by the law.
They'll go by the law, but that
Right.
but that depends on what city, right?
Right, it's going to be depending on the city ordinance. And that just goes back to that one quick example. The landlord on this eviction is, when they're coming to the money damages part, they're looking for $100 late fee for June. Then the court's going to say, landlord, how much is your rent? And then the court will impose the city ordinance on the landlord.
How does the tenant or potential tenant find that information out before they pull the trigger and lease something?
I would probably call the local court and ask them, do you guys have an ordinance that you're aware of, or can you direct me to an ordinance as far as leases in the city?
Okay,
Or
what about rural areas?
I would talk to that township again.
Okay.
But remember, the term by the law is unconscionable or unfair. So if it's something that's really excessive, no, it's not going to be awarded to you. But you know, if it says, the ordinance says $25 and your late fee is $30, that's not really unfair. That type of thing. But if it's substantially more than that, obviously it can be a problem. All right, we get to talk about late fee or security deposits now. So the security deposit is to be held until after the tenant vacates the property, unless there is a very specific agreement, usually in writing, between the landlord and tenant that allows a tenant to use their security deposit towards rent. Unless there is a specific conversation or an agreement, tenants should never assume that the landlord will just take my security deposit because I didn't pay for this month. So the way it should work in a perfect world is I vacate the property and I give you written notice. I don't like texts, I don't like emails, because the law is basically saying provide written notice to the landlord of where to send the security deposit to. That starts the clock ticking on 30 days. The landlord has 30 days to return the security deposit. After 30 days are up, if they have not returned the security deposit or the tenant doesn't agree with how the security deposit has been returned or applied, tenant can sue the landlord in small claims court for what's owed on the balance or what's owed on the security deposit. But just be careful, just make sure tenants aren't just using, well, I'm just applying it towards last month's rent, and you can't do that, not unless you have an agreement with the landlord. Okay?
Is there, like, say somebody who's rented somebody's property for 20 years and they decide to move or whatever after that, does the landlord have to, the security deposit, is there some type of, let's see how to put this, interest?
No interest unless the landlord is charging more than 1 month's rent for security. So if rent's $500 and I charge you $1,000, I may be responsible, and I'm saying maybe, I'm not giving legal, but landlord may be responsible for paying interest on the $500 over the security deposit. So security deposit is generally going to be 1 month's worth of rent.
Can they ask for more? Like some landlords, I've heard that have said, I want first month and second month's rent and security deposit.
I guess, I mean, they're asking for 2 months up front, which I guess they have the right to ask for, and the security deposit. They have the right to ask. A
lot of times they're saying also, like, a security deposit plus the last month rent plus the first month's rent. So they're actually having to put out three
that's what I meant.
rental deposits. So, but they're not labeling it a security deposit. They're labeling it the last month's rent. Does that make any difference?
Stay away from, there is no such thing as last month's rent.
Okay.
And it should just be collection of 1 month's worth of rent. Because I can't tell you as the tenant, and I can't tell you as the landlord when we enter into the agreement what the last month of rent is going to be. So a landlord should just be getting 1 month up front, generally speaking. And they may be responsible, again, for paying interest on that money if they decide to charge over than that. But I have heard last month's rent a fair amount in court, and it doesn't go well for the landlord. All right. So then this is just kind of finishing off. If after 30 days the landlord's not returned the deposit, the tenant disagrees, then the tenant can go ahead and sue it in small claims court. I want to make one last comment to you that is not included in here, and it has to do with bed bugs. Bed bugs are an infestation. They are not a pest problem. It's beyond that. The amount of cases that are reported in our cities are huge. Parties have to work together, landlords and tenants, to resolve a bed bug issue. Number one, it's really difficult to determine where the infestation came from. Extremely difficult. The real issue is what happens after we acknowledge that there's a bed bug problem. Landlords should be getting licensed and bonded exterminators. Any landlord who comes into the property themselves with their little spray and their powder to try to resolve the bed bug problem is not going to get it. The licensed and bonded exterminator needs to provide specific written preparation instructions to the tenant. So tenant may be forced to have to remove items permanently from the house, because once something is infested, it's very, very difficult. The only things that usually can be resolved, not thrown out if it's infested, is a mattress. And that's because you can buy a mattress cover and you can zip it up over the mattress, which basically seals them in at that point. But any type of furniture, carpeting, fabric, this types of things, these are homes for bed bugs. So I can't stress strongly enough, tenants must urge landlords to use licensed and bonded exterminators. And if the tenant confirms they're not using a licensed and bonded exterminator, then that's when you're serving that landlord that 30-day notice to correct it, right? Or if it's a full infestation and the landlord's really done nothing about it, maybe the tenant in that case files that motion to compel. Forgets about serving notice.
I have a question. We get a lot. I've gotten calls from clients who say they tell their landlord they live in maybe a two-family house or a multi-family dwelling, and they tell their landlord they have bed bugs, and the landlord will say they've said that the landlord has told them that they brought them there. There was no bed bugs before they moved in.
Right.
It's their responsibility to pay for the exterminator. Is that by law, anything, or?
Well, that kind of goes back to the first comment, which is it's really difficult to prove where they came from.
Right, but what does a tenant do in that case? What recourse do they have?
The tenant should serve a 30-day notice to correct or potentially file a motion to compel if they don't feel that they're, that the landlord's putting this cost on them.
Okay.
The landlord should generally take responsibility for the extermination of it. And look, if a landlord can beyond a doubt prove that you brought this in, then they may say, well, I can tell you where your security deposit's going to go. It's going to cover the cost of the extermination on the back end of it. But that's because there's no question where the bed bugs came from. And that's the real issue. It's fairly difficult to prove in court where bed bugs came from.
So
I
in a
have a question. I'm sorry.
So in a multifamily unit or a big building, it's hard to prove that in the land, and because I've had even a client call and say that they lived in a multifamily building or high rise or whatever it was, and the landlord, the company came in and did the service, and then they got it charged on their rent.
Mm-hmm. Well, at that point, I'm going to still say generally going to be the landlord's responsibility, because part of maintaining safe, habitable is part of their responsibility. Unless there's something in the lease, it's going to be the landlord's responsibility. And at that point also, because they are contentious, I would say, you know what, let's talk to an attorney. Let's talk to somebody with some experience about this. Yes.
It's Chris. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're a half hour over.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are.
And I don't want to take up any more of your time, but sure. I'll just have them, if they have more questions, they can just email them to supervisor, and then I can get them to you.
Yeah.
But this is great. This was a wonderful overview, and it's not, we don't have to be experts, and because that's why we have you. But
yeah, absolutely.
Your agency. So
and we're happy to help out. And sorry that we went over on the time. And just hopefully we were helpful.
Great. This was wonderful. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop the recording because people have started on breaks and lunches. So if you guys have any questions that you want to address, just mail them to supervisor, and I will forward them over to Gary.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
You got it. Have a great day. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.